On the night of the 13th, the moon was young, the night foggy, rainy, and intensely dark. The 5th and 6th Corps were ordered to march by farm roads, passing in rear of the 2nd and 9th, cross the Nye, move through fields to the Fredericksburg Road, on it recross the Nye, form on Burnside's left, and attack our right flank at 4 a.m. on the 14th. The 2nd Corps and the 9th were to be ready, and, when ordered, to join in the attack upon our whole line. Though every precaution had been taken to mark the way with bonfires and men posted along the route, Warren only arrived on time with about 4,000 men. The rain had put out the fires, and the men had lost their way and floundered in the mud until they were so broken and scattered that they could not be gotten into condition for operations that day, and the proposed attack was abandoned. We had doubtless had a narrow escape from serious trouble. With ordinary weather, the distance was not great, and both the 5th and 6th Corps could have surprised our flank at dawn in the morning. Our entrenchments on that flank did not then extend much beyond the courthouse. At 10 o'clock at night of the 14th came orders for our headquarters and Kershaw's division to follow Field to the right flank. There we extended our line to the right, covering Snell's Bridge over the Po. The enemy occupied himself with building defensive lines which did not follow ours toward the Po, but turned eastward and bent back toward the northeast, designed to be held by a reduced force, while he concentrated for another effort to break our line in the gorge of the salient, where he had been checked on the 12th. It had been suggested to Grant by Wright and Humphreys that, after the lapse of a few days, his movement to the left and concentration there would have caused Lee to weaken his left and afford a favourable opportunity to surprise our Bloody Angle position again. By the 17th, his works were strong enough to be held by Warren with the 5th Corps, and the 2nd and 6th were ordered to pass around the 9th during the night, and the 3 Corps to attack in conjunction at dawn, while Warren's corps cooperated with the artillery from the Federal left. The attack seemed to promise well. 3 corps of infantry were to make it, and the artillery of 4 were to support it. It would fall wholly on Ewell's corps, reduced by capture of Johnson's division on the 12th, its artillery only supplemented by a few guns of Hill's corps. It proved, however, an utter failure. The infantry was so slow in finding its way through the woods, behind which the line lay, that it was nearly 8 a.m. when it found itself in sight of our line through an opening in the woods. 29 guns opened upon it. Gibbon's and Barlow's division, which had been in the assaulting column on the 12th, again led the assault in lines of brigades, a much more effective formation than the column closed in mass, which presented itself on the 12th. They advanced over the same ground they had then traversed, and it is reported that the stench which arose from the unburied dead was so sickening and terrible that many of the officers and men were made deathly sick from it. But our guns, which had been absent before, were now in position. Already, before they emerged from the wood, they were much shaken, and some of the brigades were driven back entirely by the artillery fire, our guns giving little attention to their artillery, but confining their fire to the infantry. Only a few of these approached our abatis. None penetrated it, and the first attack was never renewed. About 10 a.m., Meade ordered the attack discontinued and the troops withdrawn. Few of our infantry were engaged, and none of them heavily for any length of time, the whole affair being decided by the artillery of the 2nd and 3rd Corps. McParlin, medical director, reports of this affair. 552 wounded were the result, and the character of the wounds were unusually severe, a large proportion being caused by shell and canister. Our own loss was very trifling. Grant, on the 19th, was preparing to move Hancock at night on the road to Richmond, and had issued the order about noon. In the afternoon he was interrupted in his preparations by the appearance of Ewell with his corps, about 6,000 men, in his rear. Lee had suspected that Grant was beginning a flanking movement, and had directed Ewell to demonstrate against him to find out. Ewell obtained leave, instead, to move around his right, hoping to accomplish the result with less loss, as Grant's position in our front was strongly entrenched. By a circuitous route and roads impassable for artillery, he took his infantry far around the enemy and crossed the Nye in their rear, near the camp of Tyler's large division and Kitching's larger brigade. Here Ewell occupied a very critical position. He was so slow in realizing this and beginning his retreat that Ramseur, fearing that further delay would cause disaster, charged the enemy. Having driven them a short distance, he retreated, and taking a position in rear with Pegram, the two were able to delay the enemy until darkness covered a withdrawal. Hancock and Warren both hurried reinforcements to Tyler, and Ewell made a lucky escape. His loss in this venture was severe for the time engaged, being about 900 killed, wounded, and missing, or 15% of his whole force. It would have cost less, and have risked much less, to have made a demonstration in front. The Federal loss was estimated at 1,100. The two battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania may be considered as parts of the one great battle of Grant and Lee, begun in the Wilderness on May 5, 1864, and terminated only at Appomattox on April 9, 1865. During all this time, the two armies were locked as if in a mortal embrace. Only by night could they shift positions. Firing by day was almost incessant. The consumption of men was far in excess of anything ever known before. The killed and wounded of the Federals in the Wilderness and Spotsylvania had been 28,202, and with 4,225 missing, the total loss had been 33,110. The Confederate losses can never be accurately known for any of the battles, from now until the close of the war, as few reports could be made in such active campaigns. Livermore's estimates give 17,250 for the same battles, the missing not included. The North Anna and Cold Harbor. After the signal failure on the 18th of his second venture at the Bloody Angle, Grant seems to have exhausted the possibilities on the Spotsylvania lines, and for his next effort he decided to lay a snare for Lee. It was thought that if Hancock's corps was sent off about 20 miles on the line of the Fredericksburg RR, that Lee would be tempted to attack it and endeavour to crush it while isolated. Grant, having every preparation made for a rapid march, might follow and attack Lee before he could entrench himself. Hancock, accordingly, marched at nightfall on the 20th, and by midday of the 21st, Barlow had crossed the Mattapony and began to entrench at Milford Station, the rest of the Second Corps following. Next morning, the Fifth Corps marched about 10 a.m., and the 6th and 9th followed later in the day. Lee never knew of the trap set for him. When he was informed of Hancock's appearance at Milford by signal stations and cavalry detachments, he supposed it to be an effort to pass him on the flank. Little time was wasted. Wilcox drove in the Sixth Corps skirmishers in an effort to find out what was going on, and Ewell was moved at once across the Po, on the right, and about noon was started to Hanover Junction. Longstreet followed him at night, and Hill moved at the same time by a parallel road. Longstreet marched all night and until about noon on the 22nd, when we bivouacked on the south side of the North Anna, about 30 miles from the camps we had left, and within a mile of the junction. Hill, who had now returned to duty, crossed the North Anna about 10 miles above us on the 22nd, and moved down next morning. The lure set for Lee had failed of its object. To make the effort, Hancock had been sent by a route about 9 miles longer than the most direct from Grant's left to Hanover Junction, which was only 25 miles and 3 miles shorter than Lee's shortest. Having the additional advantage of the initiative, it was doubtless an error on Grant's part to undertake it. On the 22nd, it was learned that all three of Lee's corps had passed the night before, and the Federal corps were now all directed to follow. At Hanover Junction, Lee received his first reinforcements, about 9,000 men. On May 15th, Breckinridge had severely defeated Sigel at Newmarket, in the valley, and driven him south of Cedar Creek, allowing Lee to bring down Breckinridge with 2 brigades of infantry, about 2,500 men. Beauregard, on May 16th, had also defeated Butler at Drury's Bluff, allowing Lee to send for Pickett's division, about 5,000 men. Hoke's brigade, about 1,200 strong, was also brought from Petersburg and assigned to Early's division. Gordon was promoted and assigned to the remnant of Johnson's division, to which also his own brigade under Evans was now transferred from Early. We had taken position behind the North Anna, but had not yet selected a line of battle or started any entrenchments, when early in the afternoon the enemy appeared north of the river and opened fire with artillery upon two slight bridgehead works at the north ends of the railroad bridge and the telegraph road bridge, which had been constructed to repel raiders a year before. We brought up guns and replied, but ravines on the north side allowed covered approaches to both bridgeheads, and both were captured with some prisoners. We held, however, the south end of the railroad bridge until after dark and burned it. Hancock's corps had approached along the railroad and the telegraph road. Burnside's corps, next on his right, was directed on the Ox Ford, a crossing about 2 miles above the railroad. The 5th Corps came to the river at Jericho Mills, 4 miles above the railroad, and, finding no enemy opposing, a pontoon bridge was laid and the whole corps was crossed by 4:30 p.m. Meanwhile, at Ox Ford, Burnside had found the south bank held in such force that it was not deemed prudent to attack. The 6th Corps was held in reserve on the north bank. Finding himself at Jericho Mills in the vicinity of Hill's corps, Warren had formed line of battle in a very favourable position. He was able to cover his front with the edge of a wood concealing his actual line. His left rested on the river, which made a large concave bend in his rear and again drew near his right, with open ground upon that flank commanded by the artillery. But the rare opportunity of an isolated corps unentrenched was here offered, and Hill hastened to attack it. About 6 p.m. he fell upon Griffin in the centre and Cutler on the right, who had not fully formed their lines. Cutler was broken and pursued, but the artillery on that flank was able to save the situation, and Hill was finally repulsed. The casualties were about equal, perhaps 1,500 on each side. During the night, Lee had selected and entrenched an excellent line. In fact, it was too good, for it defeated its object, as the enemy never dared to attack. It rested on the river from a half-mile above the bridge to the Ox Ford, and thence, leaving the North Anna, it ran across the narrow peninsula 1.5 miles to Little River, where its left rested. Returning to the centre, on the North Anna above the bridge, the line ran southeast across a large bend of the river and rested on its right 3 miles below, near the site of Morris's Bridge. In front of us, the enemy formed with the 5th and 6th Corps before our left flank, and with the 2nd and part of the 9th before our right flank. Their two wings, both south of the river, were unable to communicate without crossing the river twice. This peculiar situation could not fail to suggest unusual opportunities to each commander. Burnside was first ordered to attack and carry Ox Ford, which would at once unite their wings and divide ours. But Burnside pronounced the task impossible and did not attempt it. Hancock on his left and Warren on his right each advanced skirmishers and felt our lines, but both reported against any attack. Lee, at this time, happened to be very much indisposed and confined to his tent, but he was exceedingly anxious, with the reinforcements which he had received, to improve the slightest opportunity to give Grant a severe blow. This seemed a rare occasion where he might fall upon Hancock's and Potter's division of the 9th before they could be assisted by the other corps. He said to his staff, "We must strike them. We must never let them pass us again." But it happened that the country occupied by the Federal lines upon both flanks, and especially on their left, was flat and open, allowing full use of their artillery, and their entrenchments were very strong. Probably it was wisely held by our subordinates that no successful attack could be made, and at night on May 26th, Grant removed the temptation. Here Lee had recovered from his illness by moving for the Pamunkey. On May 24th, Sheridan had rejoined from his expedition to the James, on which he had done some damage to the two railroads entering Richmond from the north, and burned some rolling stock and stores, but had made no impression on the campaign. I think it quite probable, however, that had Sheridan's cavalry been with the army, Grant would not have tried his vain stratagem of placing Hancock as a lure at Milford, but with his aid have endeavoured to anticipate us at Hanover Junction. So I think this raid should be classed as a blunder, like Pleasanton's at Chancellorsville and Stuart's at Gettysburg. Our most serious loss in connection with it had been the death of our brilliant cavalry leader, Maj. Gen. J.E.B. Stuart, who was killed at Yellow Tavern near Richmond on May 11th. As before said, I have always believed that Lee should have made him the successor of Stonewall Jackson when the latter was killed at Chancellorsville. Grant's total casualties in the North Anna lines, May 23rd, are given as killed 22, wounded 1460, missing 290, total 1973. The Confederate losses were probably about the same. On the 26th, Grant, at noon, started Sheridan and the pontoon trains to cross the Pamunkey River at Hanover Town. After dark, the infantry moved, and by next morning his whole army had vanished, except cavalry pickets at the sites where the bridges had stood. The movement of the enemy was not discovered until the morning of the 27th. The rough sketch map represents the essentials of the position. The army was put in motion without delay, crossing the South Anna on the railroad bridges, and, after a march of 15 miles, we encamped that night near Half Sink. The next morning, we moved about 13 miles and found ourselves near the Totopotomoy, with Grant just arriving on the opposite side. Sheridan's cavalry was in his front and under orders to make a demonstration toward Richmond. Hampton, with his own and Fitz-Lee's divisions and Butler's brigade of cavalry, recently arrived from SC, were attacked by Gregg's and Talbot's divisions, with Merritt's reserve brigade at Hoar's shop. The battle was fiercely contested all day, but the enemy had the great advantage of the Spencer magazine carbine, and late in the afternoon they drove Hampton back. Ewell's health at this time required him to surrender the command of his corps permanently to Early, who was succeeded by Ramseur, promoted. On Sunday, the 29th, Grant ordered the 6th, 2d and 5th Corps, in that order from his right to left, to reconnoitre in their fronts and locate our lines, the 9th Corps being held in reserve. The 6th Corps found only the cavalry on our left flank. The other two found our pickets on the Totopotomoy, and, at an average distance of 1,000 yards behind, our line was rapidly entrenching. Some sharp skirmishing occurred during the next 3 days, the enemy crossing the Totopotomoy and entrenching opposite to us. In many of the Federal accounts, it is assumed that Lee's attitude at this period was strictly the defensive. Perhaps it should have been, but all who were near him recognized that never in the war was he so ready to attack upon the slightest opportunity. An instance occurred on May 30th, of which I was a spectator. A half-mile in front of our line we could see Bethesda Church, an important junction point, well within the enemy's territory, and sure to be included within his lines, rapidly being extended to his left. Down a long, straight road, we had seen their cavalry all the morning, and about noon a brigade of infantry appeared. Immediately, Lee ordered Early to send a brigade to attack it. Early selected Pegram's brigade, commanded by General Edward Willis, a brilliant young officer, just promoted from the 12th GA, who had been a cadet at West Point at the beginning of the war. He had been a personal friend, and I saw his brigade start on its errand with apprehension of disaster, for it was evident that a hornet's nest would be stirred up. The Federal brigade was quickly routed and pursued, but the pursuers soon encountered a division with its artillery and were repulsed with severe loss. It had made a resolute attack, as stated by Humphreys, and lost Willis and 2 of his colonels killed. Meanwhile, Butler, having been defeated and, as said by Grant, bottled at Bermuda Hundreds, Grant decided to draw from him 2 divisions of the 10th and 1 of the 18th Corps, under command of W. H. Smith, with which to give Lee a surprise. The orders had been given on May 22nd, the troops to be brought by water down the James and up the York. On May 30th, the transports bearing them began to arrive at the White House, and to disembark about 16,000 infantry, whose coming was not known to Lee. But he, having the reinforcements which joined him at Hanover Junction, about 9,000, and receiving now Hoke's division, which had come over from Drury's Bluff, about 6,000, and being disappointed at Grant's failure to attack his lines on the Totopotomoy, had himself planned a grand stroke for June 1st. The cavalry of the two armies had been heavily engaged for 2 days near Cold Harbor, and Hoke's division was in that neighborhood. Lee proposed to extend Longstreet's corps to join it, and, attacking early, to sweep to his left behind Grant's lines, taking them in flank, while Hill and Ewell pressed them in front. He did not even yet suspect the presence of Smith's troops, and it was with high hopes of a great victory on the 1st that Longstreet's corps under Anderson, with all its artillery, marched to the vicinity of Cold Harbor during the night of May 31st. Grant had, meanwhile, determined to send 2 corps to seize Cold Harbor on the 1st. Torbert, the evening before, with his dismounted troopers and magazine carbines, had repulsed a severe attack by Fitz-Lee, but anticipating attack by Hoke's infantry in the morning, he had begun to withdraw during the night. He received orders, however, to hold the position at all hazards, on which he returned, and devoted the night to entrenching his position. The 6th Corps, from the extreme Federal right, was put in motion that night for Cold Harbor, having about 15 miles to go. Smith, with 10,000 men and 16 guns, already on the march from White House to join Grant, had also been ordered during the night to Cold Harbor. A mistake in the order took him first to Newcastle Ferry on the Pamunkey, and it was only at 4 p.m. of the 1st that he joined at Cold Harbor the 6th Corps, the head of which had reached the ground about 10 a.m. after a fatiguing all-night march. It is plain, then, that here a rare opportunity had been offered the Confederates. With Hoke's large division on its right flank, Longstreet's corps should have been able to quickly clear the way of 3 brigades of cavalry. It would have had then the opportunity to meet the 6th Corps scattered along the road for many miles, and in an exhausted condition. Unfortunately, Hoke's brigade had not been put under Anderson's command, so neither felt full responsibility. It only formed in line, but did not attack the cavalry breastworks, reporting them as too strong. Kershaw made an attack about 6 a.m., but only put into it 2 brigades. The enemy, with their magazine carbines behind entrenchments, repulsed 2 assaults with severe loss, and then the turning enterprise was abandoned. Lee was not upon the ground in the early hours of the day, and Longstreet was absent, wounded. No effort worthy the name was used to carry out Lee's plan of attack, nor were the favourable conditions appreciated, although they might have been, as only cavalry was found in our front. Hoke's division should have been used to turn their flank and get among their dismounts. While Kershaw made his attack, the remainder of the long column halted in the road, expecting the march to be presently resumed. But when the delay was prolonged and a few random bullets from the front began to reach the line, without any general instructions, the men here and there began to dig dirt with their bayonets and pile it with their tin cups to get a little cover. Others followed suit, and gradually the whole column was at work entrenching the line along which they had halted. Gradually it became known that the enemy were accumulating in our front, and then, as the country was generally flat, orders were given to close up the column and adopt its line as the line of battle, distributing our guns upon it at suitable points. Our entrenchments were scarcely more than a good beginning, a line of knee-deep trench with the earth thrown in front. It was entirely without a battis or obstruction in front, except at a point on our picket line where a small entanglement had been left by our cavalry. Meanwhile, Grant, under the mistaken idea that Lee was afraid to fight in the open, was urging an early attack before Lee had time to fortify. But it was 1 p.m. before the whole of the 6th Corps was up, and it was 6 p.m. before Smith's command was in position. In the 6th Corps, each brigade was formed in column of regiments, with the brigade on the extreme left refused. The 18th Corps was formed in columns of brigades, with the extreme right refused. So the columns of the 18th were 3 ranks deep, and those of the 6th averaged 4. The Confederate formation was but a single rank behind their breastwork, which, as has been described, was the work of but a few hours, almost without entrenching tools. There was also in it a gap of something over 50 yards, where a wooded and tangled ravine and small stream separated Hoke's and Kershaw's divisions. A rough sketch will illustrate. The distance between the lines was about 1,400 yards, and our pickets were about 300 yards in our front. About 6 p.m., we had ceased to expect an attack that evening, when a sudden increase of fire on the picket line and the opening of artillery stopped our digging and called call to arms. Soon a perfect tornado of fire broke out in front of Hoke and Kershaw, and extended, but not heavily, to Pickett's front. It soon appeared that at all points but one the enemy's advance had been checked by our fire, without its reaching our line of battle. This was at the 50-yard gap which had been carelessly left between Hoke and Kershaw. Here a body of wood, fronting on our line for about 200 yards, extended quite a distance toward the enemy, allowing their approach free from observation until they had actually passed through the gap and were in our rear. This they did in such numbers that they were able to turn to the right and left and possess themselves of a small portion on each flank, capturing a few hundred prisoners. As there were no reserves, Hunton's brigade from Pickett's division and Gregg's from Field's were hurried to the spot and checked the enemy, recovered the portion taken from Hoke, and connected the broken ends by a horseshoe some 200 yards in length. At all other points, the enemy stopped at what was practically our picket line and entrenched themselves. Darkness put an end to the fighting. The Federal loss was about 2,650. The Confederate was evidently less, as the enemy only came to close quarters near the gap in the line. Grant felt encouraged by his partial success, and believing that he had inserted the small end of a wedge, prepared to drive it home. Lee was practically fighting with a river at his back. It was only the Chickahominy, but could his army be routed, Grant could surely inflict severe losses upon it before Lee could retreat over the few available roads. The Sud Corps, on Grant's right, was ordered during the night to march around 9th and 5th and reinforce the 6th, which was ordered to the attack at dawn. But it was the dark of the moon, and the night march proved slow and exhausting. The 18th Corps was also short of ammunition, so the attack was postponed at first until 5 p.m. The 5th Corps, on June 2nd, was ordered to draw in its right flank and extend its left past the front of Fields and Pickett's to unite with Smith, and the 9th Corps was ordered to be massed in rear of the 5th and to support it in the general attack. This was now again postponed until 4:30 a.m. on the 3rd, to allow a full night's rest and ample preparation. Lee, meanwhile, was no less busy. When he found in the morning that the 2D Corps had gone from his front, he had no doubt of its destination, and marching Breckinridge's, Wilcox's, and Mahone's divisions past our rear, he extended Hoke's line to the Chickahominy. He also sent Fitz-Lee's division of cavalry across the river to observe and picket the south side. Early he directed to cross the lines which had been deserted by the Sud Corps and to sweep down to the right on the flank of the 5th. This movement captured the skirmish line of the 9th Corps, which had marched off not long before, and some of that of the 5th, which was being shied to its left. But by that time Warren had changed front to oppose it, and received assistance from the 9th Corps, and Early's advance was checked. The fighting lasted until night, and General Doles of Rhodes's division, a very valuable officer, was killed. Had Early had enough men to give his movement force, it might have had important results. On our front, the sharpshooting and artillery practice were incessant. In fact, as a diversion in favour of Early, I was ordered to be aggressive with the artillery, and on Field's line Huger's battalion was put out in front of the works to get enfilading fires. In front of Pickett and Kershaw, the enemy's entrenchments were within good range, and their accuracy of fire was such as to disable gun carriages through the embrasures by cutting their spokes. A Napoleon gun of Cabell's was placed in a pit at the end of Kershaw's line, where it was broken the night before, ammunition for it being passed up by hand along the line for several hundred yards. The country was so flat that at few points could the line be safely approached from the rear. A better horseshoe connection around the gap between Kershaw and Hoke was built to replace the temporary one of the night before, and our entrenchments everywhere got all the work we were able to put upon them, but were still quite imperfect. Grant received today a reinforcement of 3,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry under General Cesnola from Port Royal. They were sent to join Wilson's cavalry upon our left and were ordered to join in the attack upon Early next morning in flank and rear, while Warren and Burnside attacked in front. No long description of this carefully planned battle is necessary. Of course, it came off punctually to the minute, for among Grant's great and rare qualities was his ability to make his battles keep their scheduled times. One may almost say also, of course we repulsed him everywhere. For it was still true, as Stonewall Jackson had said of the Army of Northern Virginia, "We sometimes fail to drive the enemy from positions. They always fail to drive us." In that respect, our army singularly resembled the famous one-horse shay. We held together wonderfully until all our parts, worn out together, failed together at Appomattox. Naturally, as the attack had been on the largest possible scale, the repulse was unusually severe and bloody, and the roar of the battle, while it lasted, probably exceeded even that of the combats in the wilderness, which Humphreys described as often approaching the sublime. It broke forth, mingled with vast cheering in the stillness of early dawn, but it was no surprise. For over an hour the men in the trenches had been alert at hearing in front muffled commands and smothered movements. The Napoleon of Cabell's in the pit at the end of Kershaw's broken line, which had been supplied with ammunition the day before by passing it from hand to hand along the line, was to be withdrawn to the angle where the new horseshoe joined our old line, and the trench in front of its new position was abandoned. The necessary work was only finished at the approach of dawn, and, in whispers, the gunners and infantry supports rolled it back by hand, leaving the trench empty behind them. It was safely located at the embrasure prepared for it, inlading the deserted trench and double-shotted with canister. But a few minutes before the cheering enemy, who here had not 100 yards to advance through thin woods, swarmed over the parapet to find the trench deserted, into which they leaped, and to receive the double canister and the musketry and artillery of the new line as they paused, wondering at our disappearance. The sound of the battle reached Richmond, and men came out on the streets to listen to it. Some houses were prepared for an unusual influx of wounded, but few came. Richmond listened calmly, for it had confidence in the one-horse shay. The brunt of the action lasted about an hour, though at isolated places attacks were renewed, or more or less distant fire was kept up until afternoon. As a general thing, the assaults were checked at about 50 yards from our lines, but at 2 or 3 points leading officers were killed on or very near our parapets. At one point only was our parapet carried. There, a hurried location in front of Barlow's division permitted him to approach under complete shelter from fire of our line of battle within 75 yards. Here a rush captured 3 guns and some few hundred prisoners, but Finnegan's brigade soon recaptured the guns and drove out the enemy. Grant had authorized Meade, about 7 a.m., to discontinue all assaults which seemed unpromising, but Meade continued to urge renewed efforts until 1:30 p.m. Each of the principal corps complained repeatedly of crossfires of artillery which swept through the ranks from the right of Smith to the left of Hancock, as reported by Humphreys. Again, he states, the assault of the Sudie Corps could not be renewed unless the enemy's enfilading artillery fire could be silenced. Of the 6th Corps, he writes, during all this time, besides the direct fire, there was an enfilade artillery fire that swept through the ranks from the right to the left. And of the 18th Corps, the fire from the right came from a part of the enemy's works against which no part of our attack was directed, and General Smith was unable to keep it down with his artillery. The artillery so complained of was mostly Huger's battalion of 24 guns, which held the line between Pickett's and Field's divisions, and was, some of it, used in front of the breastworks. Swinton narrates that some hours after the failure of the first assault, Meade sent instructions to each corps commander to renew the attack without reference to the troops on his right or left, that the order descended through the wonted channels, but was not obeyed. The immobile lines pronounced a verdict against further slaughter. As so told, an entirely erroneous impression is here created. No such silent defiance of orders occurred, or anything like it. But there were, doubtless, in the situation described above, occasions when there was delay in obedience until artillery could be sent to suppress the hostile guns. This might be distorted in the telling, and so originate such stories. At dusk, heavy firing of musketry and artillery broke out at 2 or 3 points, and presently died away. Each side believed it had been attacked and had repulsed an assault. The actual fact was that each was putting out pickets for the night and had drawn the other's fire in false alarm. I have not mentioned them before, but throughout the campaign, whenever the lines were close together, there was likely to be heavy firing of musketry and artillery breaking out in the night, which was afterward reported to be a night attack repulsed. Every one of them upon both sides was but a false alarm. The only actual night attack of the war of which I know was the Battle of Wauhatchie near Chattanooga, October 28, 63. The Federal casualties are given for June 3 as 9948, as the losses on the first were approximately estimated at 2650, those on the 3D were approximately 7300. The loss of officers killed and wounded was particularly heavy. The total casualties of the campaign since crossing the Pamunkey were 14,129. The Confederate losses on the 3D were never reported, but are known to have been small. The Confederate medical and surgical history of the war gives 1,200 wounded and 500 missing from June 1st to 12. This, Humphrey's estimates, represents about 1,500 killed and wounded, which may be taken as a maximum. Besides the general officers already mentioned as having been killed and wounded during the campaign, there were also wounded General Kirkland of Heth's division and Lane of Wilcox's. Also, on the 3rd of June, were wounded Law of Field's division and Finnegan of Mahone's. There now ensued on Grant's part several days of indecision, while he debated what to do next. Meanwhile, to keep up appearances, regular approaches were suggested in the orders, and at one point in our front they broke ground at night a short distance in front of their line of battle and attempted the construction of a battery. Having no Coehorn mortars, we improvised mortar fire with howitzers, and the battery was never completed. But during this whole interval, a terrible fire of sharpshooters was maintained upon both sides, which made life in our cramped and insufficient trenches almost unsupportable. Scarcely anywhere in them could one stand erect without being exposed to a sharpshooter. Headlogs and loopholes built up of sandbags on the parapets gave accuracy to the fire. By watching, all the low points on the enemy's line, where men would be exposed in moving about, soon became known. The sharpshooters would then lie with guns already aimed, ready to draw the trigger at the slightest glimpse. To shield themselves from the midsummer sun, our men were accustomed to invert their muskets, sticking the bayonets in the ground and letting the hammers of 4 guns pinch the 4 corners of a blanket, under which the 4 men might crowd and get some shelter from the direct midday blaze. To visit the guns scattered all along the lines, one must crouch under the blankets and step over the men, who, in the summer of 1864, were far from being free of insect pests. Points where one could get out to the rear were fully a half-mile apart, and between brigades and regiments there would often be a gap of a few feet or a few yards, which the enemy's sharpshooters were usually watching with their fingers on the triggers. In the Federal lines their entrenchments were deeper and broader, and with abundant zigzag approaches from the rear. Their force was ample to permit frequent reliefs, while we had none, yet they suffered proportionately. Gibbon's single division reported 280 officers and men killed and wounded by sharpshooters between the 3rd of June and the 12th. Humphreys thus describes the conditions in the Federal army, which had both men and supplies in profusion. The labour in making the approaches and strengthening the entrenchments was hard. The men in the advance part of the lines, which were some miles in length, had to lie close in narrow trenches, with no water except a little to drink, and that of the worst kind, being from surface drainage. They were exposed to great heat during the day. They had but little sleep. Their cooking was of the rudest character. For over a month the army had had no vegetables. Dead mules and horses and offal were scattered all over the country, and between the lines were dead bodies of both parties lying unburied in a burning sun. The country was low and marshy in character. The exhausting effect of all this began to show itself, and sickness of malarial character increased largely. Every effort was made to correct this. Large quantities of vegetables were brought up to the army, and a more stringent police enforced. Meanwhile, Lee made 2 efforts to take the offensive against Grant's right flank and rear. On the 6th, he sent Early on the north of Mattapony Creek, and on the 7th, he made an attempt south of the same. In each case, swamps were found intervening, which prevented anything being accomplished. A few days after the battle, while Grant was still in his state of indecision and the make-believe of siege operations was going on, Halleck suggested to him the investment of Richmond on the north bank of the James. It was seriously considered as offering greater security to Washington, but finally rejected. On June 5th, Hunter in the Valley, who had succeeded Milroy, defeated Jones, who had succeeded Breckinridge. As soon as Lee learned of this, he ordered Breckinridge to return and take with him the troops he had brought to Lee at Hanover Junction. On June 12th, he took the bold move of detaching Early's whole corps and sending it to the Valley by way of Charlottesville. It was ordered to attack Hunter in rear and, having disposed of him and united with Breckinridge, to move down the valley, cross the Potomac, and threaten Washington. It is probable that in deciding upon this line of strategy, Lee was influenced by hopes that strong demonstrations against Washington might recall Grant's army for its protection, as had so often happened before. If so, however, the hope now proved vain. Grant's force proved ample to detach enough to protect Washington and still prosecute his campaign before Petersburg. If Early could be spared, it might have been wiser to have sent him to Johnston's army in Georgia. Chapter 21. The movement against Petersburg, the crisis of the war, high price of gold, difficulty of recruiting in the north. Grant crosses the James and moves on Petersburg. Hancock's corps delayed. Movements of Lee. Beauregard's defence, fighting of June 16th and 18. Success of Grant's strategy. It is now time to describe Grant's movement against Petersburg, which I think, more than any battle or other incident, constituted what may be called the crisis of the war. Possibly the South never had any real chance of success from the first, and the actual crisis was past when she fired the first gun. But though the North was immensely her superior in all the resources of war, the South was able to win many hard-fought battles, and her armies to cherish the hope, as year after year elapsed, that the desperation of her resistance might exact such a price in blood and treasure as would exhaust the enthusiasm of her adversary. Certainly, at no other period was there such depression among the people at home, in the army, in the field, or among the officials of the government in Washington. The expenses of the war were nearly $4,000 a day. Gold was at a high premium and advancing rapidly. It went from 168 in May to 285 in July. The following table shows the fluctuations for each month of 1864. Enlisting had almost ceased, although stimulated by enormous bounties. $1,000 per man was the ordinary price, and single regiments would sometimes take from their counties 1,000 men and draw $1 million in bounties the day of their muster. There was growing bitterness in political circles in view of the approaching presidential election. The terrible lists of casualties in battle were daily bringing mourning and distress to every hamlet in the country. Swinton, p. 494, writes of this period as follows. War is sustained quite as much by the moral energy of a people as by its material resources, and the former must be active to bring out and make available the latter. For armies are things visible and formal, circumscribed by time and space, but the soul of war is a power unseen, bound up with the interests, convictions, passions of men. Now so gloomy was the outlook after the action on the Chickahominy, and to such a degree, by consequence, had the public mind become relaxed, that there was at this time great danger of a collapse of the war. Had not success come elsewhere to brighten the horizon, it would have been difficult to have raised new forces to recruit the Army of the Potomac, which, shaken in its structure, its valour quenched in blood, and thousands of its ablest officers killed and wounded, was the Army of the Potomac no more. It was under these circumstances that Grant made his first move after the week of indecision which followed the Battle of Cold Harbor. The most natural movement, and the one which Lee expected, was that he would merely cross the Chickahominy and take position on the north bank of the James at Malvern Hill, adjoining Butler on the south bank at Bermuda Hundreds. This would unite the two armies at the nearest point to Richmond, and they would have the aid of the monitors on the river in a direct advance. But Grant determined to cross the James at Wilcox's Landing, 10 miles below City Point, and entirely out of Lee's observation, and to move thence directly upon Petersburg with his whole army. He would thus pass in rear of Butler and attack the extreme right flank of the Confederate line, which, it was certain, would now be held by only a small force. It involved the performance of a feat in transportation which had never been equalled and might well be considered impossible without days of delay. It was all accomplished, as will be seen, without mishap, and in such an incredibly short time that Lee refused for 3 days to believe it. During these 3 days, June 15th, 16 and 17, Grant's whole army was arriving at and attacking Petersburg, which was defended at first only by Beauregard, with about 2,500 men. Lee, with Longstreet's and Hill's corps, for the same 3 days, lay idle in the woods on the north side, only replacing some of Beauregard's troops taken to Petersburg from in front of Butler. But for this, Longstreet's corps might have manned the entrenchments of Petersburg when Grant's troops first appeared before them, and it is not too much to claim that his defeat would have been not less bloody and disastrous than was the one at Cold Harbor. For while the entrenchments at Cold Harbor were the poorest and slightest in which we ever fought, the Petersburg lines had been built a year before, and were of the best character, with some guns of position mounted and all the forest in front cleared away to give range to the artillery. This, then, was really the nearest approach to a crisis which occurred during the war, as will more fully appear as we follow the details. Instead of success elsewhere, Grant here escaped a second defeat more bloody and more overwhelming than any preceding. Thus the last, and perhaps the best, chances of Confederate success were not lost in the repulse at Gettysburg, nor in any combat of arms. They were lost during 3 days of lying in camp, believing that Grant was hemmed in by the broad part of the James below City Point, and had nowhere to go but to come and attack us. The entire credit for the strategy belongs, I believe, to Grant, though possibly it may be shared by Meade's Chief of Staff, Humphreys, whose modest narrative makes no reference to the subject. On Saturday, June 11th, the 5th Corps was moved down the Chickahominy, about 10 miles to the vicinity of Bottom's Bridge. The next night it crossed on 2 pontoon bridges, and, inclining to the right, it took position east of Riddle's shop, where it entrenched to cover the passage of the other corps. All of the other corps moved at the same time. The 2d Corps crossed at the same bridge and marched to Wilcox Landing on the James. The 6th and 9th Corps crossed the Chickahominy at Jones's Bridge and marched to the same place. The 18th Corps, under Smith, was sent back to the White House, where it took transports for City Point, and was landed there the night of the 14th. Here it was joined by Coutz's cavalry, about 2,400 strong, and by Hinck's coloured division, 3,700, making in all about 16,000 men, who were ordered to march at dawn on the 15th for Petersburg, about 8 miles, which they were to attack. Here we may leave them for a while. Hancock's 2d Corps reached Wilcox's Landing at 6 p.m. on Monday, the 13th, after an all-night march of about 30 miles. After the 5th Corps, under Warren, held its position covering the passage of other corps until night of the 13th, when it followed Hancock and reached Wilcox's Landing the next noon. The cavalry and infantry had had some sharp skirmishing, and reported their casualties as 300 killed and wounded. The 6th and 9th Corps, whose marches had been from 5 to 10 miles longer than Hancock's, arrived in the afternoon of the 14th. During the 14th, The transports, which had brought the 18th Corps around from the White House to City Point, were employed in ferrying Hancock across the James. By the morning of the 15th, his whole corps was across, with most of its artillery, and at 10:30 a.m. it set out for Petersburg, following Smith, who had gone from City Point for the same destination about sunrise. Hancock had about 20,000 men and about 16 miles to go. All the complicated movements involved in this manoeuvre and in the capture of Petersburg at which it was aimed had been as usual well thought out and covered in the orders and instructions to the different commanders, with a single exception. This exception was very serious in its results, as it postponed the capture of Petersburg for over 9 months. It had its rise in the division of command and responsibility between the cooperating armies. This, in its turn, had arisen from the political necessity of placing Butler in command of the Army of the James. Smith's corps was a part of that army, and Grant, feeling that secrecy was essential to success, visited Butler on the 14th, and at his quarters prepared the orders for Smith's advance and attack on Petersburg the next day. When he returned to the Army of the Potomac, he failed to notify Meade of the hour of Smith's march and other details, and Meade, of course, did not inform Hancock. It resulted that Hancock was not ordered to march until 10:30 a.m., when he might just as easily have marched at sunrise, and he was directed by a route an hour or two longer than one he might have used. Finally, he came upon the field at Petersburg after dark, when he might have arrived in time to unite in Smith's assault. Meanwhile, the 5th, 6th, and 9th Corps, on the banks of the James, awaited the construction of the greatest bridge which the world has seen since the days of Xerxes. At the point selected, the river was 2,100 feet wide, 90 feet deep, and had a rise and fall of tide of 4 feet, giving very strong currents. A draw was necessary for the passage of vessels. The approaches having been prepared on each side, construction was begun at 4 p.m. on the 14th by Major Duane, simultaneously at both ends. In 8 hours the bridge was finished, and the artillery and trains of the 9th, 5th, and 6th Corps began to cross in the order named, that being the order in which the corps would follow. For 48 hours, without cessation, the column poured across, and at midnight on the 16th, Grant's entire army was south of the James. Let us now turn to Lee. On the morning of the 13th, finding the enemy gone, he at once put his army in motion, crossed the Chickahominy, and that afternoon took position between White Oak Swamp and Malvern Hill. Hoke's division went on to Drury's Bluff. His cavalry came in contact with Wilson's cavalry and also with Warren's infantry, which had entrenched itself on the Long Bridge Road not far in front of his position. Some sharp skirmishing took place, as shown by Warren's report of 300 casualties. The presence of Warren was taken as assurance that Grant's army was about to advance on the north side of the James, and Warren's withdrawal at dark, discovered the next day, was supposed to mean only a drawing nearer to Butler's position, where the narrowness of the river would permit the easy establishment of pontoon bridges. On the 14th, a staff officer of Beauregard's came over from Petersburg to lay before Lee the defenceless position of that city, and to beg for reinforcements. Lee consented that Beauregard should take Hoke's division, which had already gone to Drury's Bluff, but would not consent to weaken Longstreet or Hill, who were near Riddle's shop. Hoke was accordingly started for Petersburg early on the 15th, with 18 miles to go. His leading brigade, Haygood's, was picked up by railroad trains and reached Petersburg about sunset, the rest of the division arriving about 9 p.m. Until Hoke came, the whole force at Petersburg consisted of Wise's brigade of infantry, not more than 1,200 strong, 2 small regiments of cavalry under Deering, some light artillery with 22 pieces, besides a few men manning 3 or 4 heavy guns in position. Besides these, there were some old men and boys, called local reserves, who on June 9th, under Col F. H. Archer, a veteran of Mexico, and Gen. R. E. Colston, disabled at Chancellorsville, had acted with great gallantry in repelling a raid by Coutz's cavalry. The total gross of all arms is given as 2738. After Beauregard's staff officer had left him, Lee gave orders to our corps to march the next morning, the 15th, to Drury's Bluff. About sunrise, we broke camps and took the road, but there was a demonstration of the enemy's cavalry about Malvern Hill, and we were halted to learn what it meant. About midday, the report came that the enemy had fallen back, but our march was not resumed, and we later returned to our bivouacs. On the 16th, the 1st Corps headquarters, with Pickett's and Field's divisions, were hurried across the pontoon bridge at Drury's Bluff and down to the Bermuda Hundreds lines, which had been held by Bushrod Johnson's division, but had been abandoned the night of the 15th when Beauregard had withdrawn it for the defence of Petersburg. Kershaw's division followed us only as far as Drury's Bluff and was halted there. We reached the ground in time to drive off one of Butler's brigades, which had come out to the railroad and begun to tear it up. We drove this brigade back very nearly into their original lines, and on the next afternoon, the 17th, a charge of Pickett's division entirely regained our lines, which had been abandoned by Bushrod Johnson. During these 3 days, the 15th, 16th, and 17th, Beauregard, while defending Petersburg with great skill and tenacity, had repeatedly reported to Lee the arrival of Grant's army at Petersburg and begged for reinforcements. Lee's replies were as follows. June 16th, 10:30 a.m. I do not know the position of Grant's army and cannot strip the north bank of troops. June 17th, 12th m. Until I can get more definite information of Grant's movements, I do not think it prudent to draw more troops to this side of the river. On this day, Grant's entire force being now on the field, his attacks were urged with increasing vigour, and at 6:40 p.m. Beauregard telegraphed Lee as follows. The increasing number of the enemy in my front and inadequacy of my force to defend the already too much extended lines will compel me to fall back within a shorter one, which I will attempt tonight. This I shall hold as long as practicable, but without reinforcements I may have to evacuate the city very shortly. In that event I shall retire in the direction of Drury's Bluff, defending the crossing of Appomattox River and Swift Creek. After the receipt of this dispatch, Kershaw's division was ordered to proceed during the night to Bermuda Hundreds, and a little later the order was extended to continue the march to Petersburg. The fighting on Beauregard's lines lasted until nearly midnight, but when it was over and the transfer of his troops to their new line was fairly underway, he began to take more radical measures to convince Lee of the situation. He sent 3 of his staff, one after the other, within 2 hours, with details about the prisoners captured from different corps of the Federal Army, with the stories told by each of their marches since leaving Cold Harbor on the 12th. The first messenger was Beauregard's aide, Coller Chisholm, who interviewed Lee lying on the ground in his tent near Drury's Bluff between 1 and 2 a.m. on the 18th. Lee seemed very placid and heard many messages, but still said he thought Beauregard was mistaken in supposing that any large part of Grant's army had crossed the river. He said also that Kershaw's division was already under orders to Petersburg, and he promised to come over in the morning. Chisholm was soon followed by Coller Alfred Roman, but he had to leave his messages, as Lee's staff would not disturb him again. About 3 a.m., Madge Giles B. Cook arrived and insisted upon an interview. He brought further statements by prisoners which, laid before Lee, thoroughly satisfied him that Grant's army had now been across the James for over 48 hours. The following telegrams, which were immediately sent, will indicate his change of view. June 18th, 3:30 a.m. Superintendent R&PRR. Can trains run to Petersburg? If so, send all cars available to Rice's turnout. If they cannot run through, can any be sent from Petersburg to the point where the road is broken? It is important to get troops to Petersburg without delay. To General Early, Lynchburg. Grant is in front of Petersburg. Will be opposed there. Strike as quick as you can. If circumstances authorize, carry out the original plan or move upon Petersburg without delay. At the same time, Orders were sent to Anderson for Field's division and the Corps headquarters and artillery to follow Kershaw's division into Petersburg. Kershaw arrived there about 7:30 a.m., the rest of us about 9. We must now return to Smith's column, which we saw start to Petersburg, about 16,000 strong, at daylight on the 15th, with about 8 miles to go, 2,500 of the command being cavalry, 3,700 of them coloured troops. Beauregard awaits them in the lines of Petersburg, which encircle the city, about 2 miles out from the river above to the river below, a development of about 10 miles. The entrenchments had no abattis or obstructions in front and consisted only of a small outside ditch and a parapet, with platforms and embrasures for guns at suitable intervals. As Beauregard expected Hoke's division about dark, every moment of delay was valuable. To prolong it, he used the old device of sending forward a regiment of cavalry and a battery. These delayed the approach for about 3 hours at the expense of a gun captured. The march was then resumed, and about 9 a.m. the head of the column came to the zone of felled forest in front of the entrenchments. Beauregard, fortunately, had a good supply of guns and ammunition which he used freely in preventing the enemy from establishing his batteries or moving his troops within sight, and it was 1:30 p.m. when the column was deployed. Smith had still to make his reconnaissance, and this occupied him until 5 p.m. But it had been efficiently made, for he learned that our infantry was stretched out in a very thin line, and it led him to decide that his charge should be made, not with a column, but with clouds of skirmishers. Another hour was taken to form the troops, and at 6 p.m. all would have been ready, but it was now found that the chief of artillery had sent all the horses to water, and it required an hour to get them back. Tall oaks from little acorns grow. By such small and accidental happenings does fate decide battles. Petersburg was lost and won by that hour. At 7 p.m. the guns returned and opened a severe fire, to which the Confederate guns did not reply, reserving their fire for the columns which they expected to see. These never appeared, but instead the cloud of skirmishers overran the works and captured the guns still loaded with double canister and defended by only a skirmish line of infantry. Hinks' coloured division, which made the charge, lost 507 killed and wounded from the fire of the skirmishers. It captured 4 guns and 250 prisoners. Lines of battle followed, and by 9 p.m. occupied about 1.5 miles of entrenchment, from Redan No. 7 to No. 11, inclusive, counting from the river below, getting possession of 16 guns. Hancock's corps had arrived on the ground during the action, and when it was over, at Smith's request, it relieved his troops. Smith had been informed of the approach of reinforcements to both sides, and he thought it wiser to hold what he had than to venture more and risk disaster. Kautz's cavalry had been kept beyond the entrenchments all day by Deering's cavalry and a few guns, which fired from the Redans in the vicinity of No. 28. About 6 p.m., hearing no sounds of battle from Smith, Kautz withdrew, with a loss of 43 men, and went into bivouac. After the fighting began, Beauregard had recognized that he would need every available man to defend the city, and he ordered Johnson to leave only Grade's brigade in his lines, and to come to Petersburg with the rest of his division. Johnson brought about 3,500 men, which, with Hoke, gave Beauregard in the morning an effective force of about 14,000 infantry. During the night he built a temporary line, throwing out the captured portion, while his efficient chief engineer, Colin D.B. Harris, laid out and commenced a better located permanent line at an average distance of a half-mile in the rear. On the 16th, Hancock was in command, and the 9th Corps arrived on the field, giving him about 48,000 effectives. He devoted the day to attacks upon each flank of the broken line, and succeeded in capturing 1 Redan, No. 4, on Beauregard's left, and 3, No. 12, 13, and 14, on his right. On the 17th, the fighting began at 3 a.m. and was continued until 11 p.m. The attack at 3 was conducted by Potter's division of the 9th Corps, and was a complete surprise. Extraordinary precautions had been adopted to make it so. No shot was fired. Canteens had been packed in knapsacks, and all orders were transmitted in whispers. The Confederates were so exhausted by their incessant fighting by day and working by night that they were sound asleep, with arms in their hands and double canister in their guns. Only a single gunner was waked in time to pull a single lanyard before the enemy swept over and got possession of Redan No. 16, with 4 guns and 600 prisoners. Nowhere else during the long day were they able to make any headway. The 5th Corps had now arrived, and 1 division of the 6th. About dark in the afternoon, Redan No. 3, on the left, had been taken and held temporarily by Ledley's division of the 9th Corps. Grade's brigade, which had just come in from Bermuda Hundreds, was put to charge them, and drove them out, capturing over 1,000 prisoners. After the fighting ceased, Colonel Harris superintended the withdrawal of the troops from the temporary line to the new location which had been prepared in the last 48 hours.